Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Psychedelic Vantage. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Burton J. Tabaac and Teresa Yung, co-authors of an exciting paper recently published in full in Frontiers in Pharmacology titled Clinical Improvements Following an Integrative Iboga Microdosing Protocol in Post-Concussive and Hypoxic Brain Injury Syndromes, a case series. So, there's been a lot of recent news in the media around Ibogaine, the principal psychoactive alkaloid in Iboga, and its potential to treat substance use disorders. So, today I'm really looking forward to learning more about research outside of addiction, specifically and into Iboga microdosing and traumatic brain injury. Burton, Teresa, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on the channel today.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
for
so
having
much
us.
for having us.
Absolutely. So before we look into the recent paper, I wanted to ask you both maybe to share about your background and what brought each of you into psychedelic research.
Yeah, it always starts with the why. And I find most people that I meet in this path of healing, working with plant medicines, always have a very personal why of their own. I'm no exception. Had my own desires to explore and found myself in wanting to heal from traumatic experiences of losing people in my life to unexpected accidents. And then eventually that path actually led me to heal from different experiences that I had in my early childhood years. And it's beautiful in that it really specifically led me to this path with Iboga. And it was specifically with Iboga, specifically with microdosing Iboga, not necessarily these really big journeys that people also seek various plant medicines for, that really led to, yeah, a alleviation of very intense symptoms of complex PTSD. And it was very, very unique that it was microdosing. My hypothesis is that because of the microdosing, it allowed for the more particular parts that perhaps sit in more traumatized places that larger experiences might be overwhelming for. The microdosing context actually allowed these to surface, even after years of pursuing other plant medicines that were more traditional for healing trauma. So I'm immensely grateful that these things that happened in my past actually led to this yeah, really deepening of study and learning of why microdosing is impactful for healing. So that's a bit of my path.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Teresa. And I'm sure we'll get into it later in this interview, but I was curious to ask, with Iboga microdosing, is it at um subperceptual doses, or are people feeling a little bit different with this protocol that people use?
Yeah, a lot of people have that question. The specific reason that we work with the 6-week protocol is actually to allow for the noribogaine, this psychoactive alkaloid, one of 9 that's within the full iboga plant, to build up in the liver. And so when people start, it really varies across the board. Some people can immediately feel it. Some people, it really takes some time for it to kind of cross this perceptual barrier. And it is important for us to reach that moment because Iboga has a unique way of really amplifying and emphasizing the patterns that it wants us to look at. And so, unlike other psychedelics or plant medicines that people might work with microdosing, where it stays really subperceptual, like psilocybin, for example, we do actually work with the perceptiveness of Iboga microdosing, and this will then build across the protocol, and it will also vary from day to day, week to week. So we really can't say that it's going to be one specific experience. Um, Vary by person, it'll vary by what's happening in your life, it'll vary by perhaps the intelligence of the medicine itself, it'll vary by your own ability to create the relationship with the medicine and perceive what's happening inside the system. Again, it's why Burton and I have really emphasized working with support, working inside of a container. And, obviously we have to name the teachers who have taught us and have been working with this medicine for over a decade. And they themselves also have shown um, what are the things to look for that are very specific to this medicine that will help us in this journey.
Great.
I'd love to add to that. Teresa, it's such an honor to hear from you, and I'm so grateful that we have had this opportunity to collaborate. My background is as a allopathic trained neurologist, and what drew me to this space was after completing 4 years of a conventional medical school education and then 4 years of residency. It wasn't until my fellowship at the Johns Hopkins University, where I was attending a Grand Rounds talk, where I even became privy to this field. And it struck me as really inspiring that psychedelics could serve as therapeutics. And I thought it odd that psychedelics were not mentioned even once in a 8 year conventional medical education. Now, as we get into the depths and the nuance in discussing this paper, I also want to underscore and acknowledge the Sangoma healers who served a really critical role in this protocol. And so, with that, I want to acknowledge Lauren Hoffmeyer and Simon Anderson of the Traditional Healers Organization, Thou Art Visionary Ecosystem, and Mpande Ethnomedicine for their guidance, support, and partnership. Because Iboga is a Schedule 1 drug, which I think is a political designation rather than a medical one, because clearly, if Schedule 1 is defined as no medical benefit, this paper challenges that. These patients were able to source the medicine on their own by working with the Sangoma healers. And a key component here, which I hope we get into, is that yes, there is something happening at a neurological biocellular level, and yet, we know that psychedelics are truly maximized with the right context when they're paired with therapy. And so, as we've been talking about this paper, there's a lot of attention on the Iboga microdosing protocol, but I would be remiss if I didn't invite Teresa to talk a little bit about the therapy adjunct to this really crucial cocktail of treatment.
100%. I'm really looking forward to learning more about the type of psychotherapy that was used in this case series. Thank you so much for these really great comprehensive answers. So to start, first of all, what is traumatic brain injury? What is chronic hypoxic ischemic brain injury, and what is post-concussive syndrome?
Yeah, so these are all umbrella terms, and recognizing the audience who is likely going to be listening in, I want to keep this general without getting into the pathophysiology of what's happening with different receptors. So, generally speaking, uh, post-concussive syndrome can include traumatic brain injuries with or without loss of consciousness. And usually, this is when there's a physical insult. So, we're not talking about an emotional trauma. We're talking about an actual physical injury to someone's body. And that could be, in our case report, we highlight examples of someone in a motor vehicle accident and another case of someone in a motorcycle accident. This could be also, we see traumatic brain injuries from uh, insults that are incurred from war in veteran population. And that really speaks to the work with Ibogaine and the Nolan Williams research paper at Stanford, where special op forces were treated. Traumatic brain injury can be incurred from a fall, could be incurred from sports. And so a physical injury to the brain that leads to long-term sequelae. And what I mean by that is a constellation of symptoms that can include and range from anything from headache to brain fog, changes in wakefulness and alertness. It could be mood irritability, disruptions in sleep wake cycles. You can see dysregulation with sexual side effects, lightheadedness, ringing in the ears. There's a lot of different long-term effects that can be tied into the traumatic brain injury, and the current conventional pathway is to treat those symptoms. And after a period of time, a lot of these patients are left with symptoms in which the current standard of care is to address these symptoms purely symptomatically without getting to the true underlying root and promoting true healing at a cellular level. And then hypoxic injury is when there's a period of time where the brain goes without oxygen. And so if there's a prolonged period of hypoxia, lack of oxygen, the brain can starve and end stage damage can occur from that injury. And so our third case is of a woman who was in an avalanche, who was under snow for a period of time, and then her boyfriend rescued her and she survived, but yet was left with the sequelae and constellation of symptoms from that insult.
Great. That was a great answer, obviously. Thank you. It's great to learn about this. And it seems that with these types of brain injuries, yeah, there's a variety of symptoms that come along with it, whether it's physical, cognitive, emotional, psychological, and it seems that there's early promise that Ibogaine could address many of these from that Stanford study you mentioned. Also, looks like there's some promise with potentially microdosing Iboga as well, based on this case series. I wanted to now, like, getting into the protocol that was used, I guess just sticking, and we'll definitely talk about the therapy, but in terms of the microdosing protocol that was used in the study, like what did the dosing regimen protocol look like here?
I want to tee this up for Teresa with a preface. And you invoked two different terms here, Iboga and Ibogaine. So for the listeners, I would love to be really clear and distinguish the two. So Iboga is a root bark, mostly from Gabon, Africa, and Ibogaine is the alkaloid, one of the components. And the reason why I really want to underscore this is because there is this really fascinating field of debate looking at the entourage effect, where it's not perhaps just the Ibogaine that is promoting healing benefit when we think about plant medicine, but the whole plant as a whole has other alkaloids and other elements, the Iboga root bark itself, that can actually be really beneficial. And what makes this paper unique is that a lot of the medical literature to date looks at Ibogaine isolate, whereas we look at patients that are sourcing Iboga, the biomass, from the Sangoma healers. With that, I'm going to invite Teresa to elaborate.
Thank you, Burton. Yeah, this is a important discussion with a lot of people having different opinions. I think there's something really beautiful to look at how does nature already present something for us. I think there's even some sort of a myth down in the jungles in the Amazon that whenever there's an illness, within the 1 mile radius of that illness, you will find its antidote. So yeah, the protocol that we worked with is this 4 days on, 3 days off protocol. This again was introduced to us by the Sangoma healers that we work with. And it's the reason we use this is again to capitalize on the effect of the buildup of the noribogaine in the liver so that it's building up in concentration and perceptibility, and then having this experience then of coming off. So build up and coming off, build up and coming off over the course of 6 weeks. The way that we work with dosing is also a different approach than what you might find in traditional Western treatment, which oftentimes is this same time of day, same amount for everyone across the board. A big underlying shift in orientation that we work with here, which I think might bring up some nervousness because it's less controlled. It's also less easy to perhaps replicate in studies, which is, we named this a lot in this case series. We really wanted to acknowledge that there's a lot of variability here. But we do this because we recognize that every single client has different needs, and that their own wisdom and understanding of what's happening on each day may then create some variability in the exact dosage. So we always work within a specific dosage, less than 1.5 grams. And the way that we then determine what dosage they need is actually using their own body wisdom to tell us, is it half a gram? Is it 0.7? Is it 0.8? All within the understanding that anything under 1.5 grams is not going to lead to any larger psychedelic experience. To give some context, a typical flood dose, which is what maybe more people are used to hearing about these infamous 70-hour type of journeys, is usually more than 15 grams. So we're still working within a realm of a very low amount of medicine. Over the course of the 6 weeks, what's interesting is that people do end up having around the same amount of what a flood dose would be, but of course, just intermittently scheduled out across the 6 weeks.
I see. Very fascinating. It sounds like it was very personalized here. And so I'm pretty familiar with, I guess, second, third wave forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. But, looking at this study, I was seeing that what was utilized was accelerated, experiential, dynamic psychotherapy. Can you break that down for us? What is that?
Yeah. I have to also take the time to really acknowledge AEDP and its founder, Diana Fosha, who's a dear friend. I had the opportunity to meet her during my time as the director of operations at a foundation called the Trauma Research Foundation, which is headed up by this MD Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book Body Keeps the Score. I had the wonderful opportunity to work with that foundation for a number of years, and it's what actually was the stepping point of diving really deep into understanding the psychology behind trauma, and is what I was doing before starting to pursue my PhD at Meridian University. And I met Diana, and she told me about this modality that she has been pioneering. And what really captured me about this, so a little bit about it is it's essentially a mix of somatic, so really bringing the awareness into what's happening inside of the body, the felt sense, polyvagal, what's happening inside of the nervous system, parts work. A lot of people know parts work from Dick Schwartz and his work with internal family systems. And then my favorite part of it, even though all four of these pieces are equally as important, used together, is the attachment work. What is happening interrelationally? So what's happening here with you and I, and what's happening intra-relationally, what's happening inside of the parts inside of the individual. A lot of modalities might work on just one, which again, this is similar to Western medicine. It's great that we have concentration so that then there are experts. But in reality, what's happening inside of a person is that the nervous system, the body, the mind, the heart, the gut, all of these systems are impacted when it comes to trauma. And therefore, being able to really work holistically and pay attention to all of these systems at once is really important. And this is what AEDP really offers. It's uniquely paired with Iboga because Iboga also is amplifying these systems as well. What's happening inside of the nervous system, what's happening inside of the body, what is happening with the parts that are being formed due to the trauma incurred, and what is happening also inside of each person. Dick Schwartz talks about parts like exiled parts, manager parts, defender parts. When trauma occurs, you could look at this constellation of parts happening inside of a person. The part that was traumatized in an injury, we don't even have to talk about, emotional trauma, but the part that was traumatized in an injury, when something so overwhelming like being buried in an avalanche, you can only imagine what's happening within the body. There is a disconnection with the overwhelming parts in order to help the body, the psyche, the emotions to survive that incident. Post-trauma, once we're returned to a place of safety, then opens up the period of healing where those parts that were so disassociated from the overwhelm are able to resurface and be worked with. Neurologically, and Burton can talk to this, Iboga is working with many different brain structures. The amygdala, which has to do with our fight, flight, fear centers. The hippocampus, which has to do with the way that we are storing long-term and short-term memory. The insula, which has to do with our interior perception, the somatics, what's being felt. And when trauma happens, all of these parts are being affected. With Iboga, all of these parts in the brain are also being worked with. The ability to help re-narrativize our story and identity about ourselves. The ability to quiet the amygdala and the fear centers, which then allow us to access traumatic content. The insula that then helps to amplify our connection to these emotions and these feelings. Not to mention the 13 different neuroreceptor sites that have to do with serotonin and dopamine that then change our reward systems. And this again is going to affect, a lot of cases that have to do with addiction and reward pathways. But Burton's the on-site expert here when it comes to the actual brain structures. But it's very interesting, this intersection, which is, why we're here, of psychology, of neurology, of therapeutics, and exactly the Iboga's profile of how it brings it all together.
Yeah. Burton, you wanted to add?
Teresa, are you sure you're not getting your PhD in neurology? Because all of that was really well put together. So if you're looking for a dual specialty, I think you're well suited. The one thing that I really feel inspired to comment on is this really well appreciated phenomenon in neurology called augmentation, where if someone has a neurological diagnosis, and whether that be in this case traumatic brain injury, but it can also apply to anything in the neurological field, dementia, Parkinson's, even headaches, pain constellation. If there is superimposed or concomitant anxiety and or depression, all of the symptoms of the neurological diagnosis are magnified or augmented. And with that, Jake, I think this is a really good opportunity to speak to your curiosity that on the seed that you planted at the start here, where we were talking about it being interesting that medicine separates neurology and psychiatry into separate disciplines. And so I think one of the most important shifts that could evolve in medicine is a recognition that the traditional divide between neurology and psychiatry is in many ways artificial. Both specialties are fundamentally concerned with the same organ, the brain. So, with neurology historically focusing on structural and physiological dysfunction, psychiatry focusing on cognition, emotion, behavior, these are simply different expressions of the same underlying biology. And with that, the mind-body connection is not a metaphor. It is a neurobiological reality. Our thoughts, emotions, stress levels, relationships, and even life experiences can influence brain function, while changes in brain structure and circuitry can affect mood and perception and behavior. So, as neuroscience advances, we're increasingly seeing that conditions that were once considered purely psychiatric have measurable neurological correlates. And with that, neurological diseases can carry significant psychiatric dimensions. So, I believe the future lies in a more integrated approach, one that recognizes the inseparability of brain, mind, and body, and then treats patients through that unified lens.
And Vern, just following up on that, this is not an original idea for me. I heard it from someone else in a podcast a while ago, but I'm curious if you would agree that I think this doctor said that once a psychiatric diagnosis is like 100% understood, it then is considered a neurological disorder. I think I was saying along the lines of that. Would Yeah.
So that comment reminds me of this interview where there was a journalist at a psychiatric conference asking psychiatrists in attendance how many patients they have cured. And when you can characterize something and there is a biochemical and organic underpinning, it really does speak to this phenomenon where we are part and parceling everything and dissecting everything. And that's what I really like about the work being done in the psychedelic space is twofold. One is that there is this sense of mysticism where everything should not be dissected and we should appreciate the medicines and the ineffability about them. And science may never actually truly understand and answer the hard question of consciousness. But also that second piece of interdisciplinary partnership, where if we can take what we have learned from neurology and psychiatry and psychology and marry them together in a way that is curated to the individual patient, A lot of the time, the medicine is doing the work. And my advisor, Gul Dolan, speaks to the importance of context, where, it's not just that this medicine is working in a vacuum. She likes to say you can't take Molly and go to a rave and think it's going to cure your PTSD. There's something very, really important about intentionality and the partnership with the therapist. And so, calling it back to this protocol, there is something really to be said about, yes, it's not just that medicine, which truly has a cellular function and a pathway, but it's opening up critical periods and allowing for metaplasticity for the therapeutic component to really land and have an effect.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So, you know, coming back to the protocol now that was used in this case series, what did the results look like? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so there's a couple different comments here, and I'd really like to get Teresa's take on this as well. So I followed the patients a little bit more sporadically, where I was aware that they were pursuing this protocol. I was able to capture them prior to initiation, midway through, and then importantly at a long-term follow-up. And what we could see is that all three patients did have marked improvement across every single symptom that they had complained of, ranging from headaches, dizziness, brain fog, mood irritability, sleep dysregulation. And what was really fascinating is that the benefits in two out of the three patients were sustained after the protocol completed at a 3-month follow up. And so that's really profound and very different from the current paradigm of treatment, where patients are relegated to taking lifelong medications to treat symptoms. So that makes me really wonder and posit that perhaps that something underlying the true injury itself was being addressed through this protocol, given at least in one patient, complete symptom resolution where she had suffered for 7 years. And that's our patient who is in the avalanche. Teresa?
Yeah, what's really unique here, they're all unique. Maybe that's an important thing, is that they're just all so unique.
Yes.
And I know that our typical way of treating these days, because of speed and efficiency, is to try and generalize. The beautiful thing that we're finding is that this medicine brings to the surface a lot more that's perhaps just underneath the physical injury. And again, this is the very unique thing about this case study, and also this wonderful relationship that Burton and I have been forging over these years, that I'm just so deeply grateful for, is this coming together of the clinical and the therapeutic. I haven't read any other case study that actually includes the therapeutic progression notes.
Mm.
And this is a big miss. It's a really, really big miss. And I know many people have already griped about this, in the sense of, I go to my doctor and there's never one question about, well, what's happening in your home life?
Mm.
What's going on inside? And there's no conversation then between the providers, when the information is so necessary to marry together, as Burton said. And so what I have found as people read through this case study is that they do bring up what's happening emotionally, the notes that are happening, that were included in terms of their therapeutic progression. And in the process of submitting this case study to a number of various journals, my own personal insecurity was this, that this hasn't been done before. And what is the scientific community going to think about a case study that's including therapeutic progression notes? Are they even going to care?
Mm. Wow.
And my hope so much is that they do, and that they really read it comprehensively, as we've written it. What was happening clinically and what was happening therapeutically, to bring to the forefront that we really that this is important. Um, One of the patients, they were on SSRIs for 17 years. This
Mm.
clearly is not from the traumatic brain injury.
Mm.
There was many things that were happening underneath. And the beauty of my work and what I love so much is treating what was happening underneath. Um, People can read these in the notes. I won't go into so much detail, but what I can say is that the for me, the meat of it, even though it's right now being studied as how can we treat traumatic brain injury, or what are the implications for things like Parkinson's and MS and neurological disorders, which is so big. What I've seen over the years of working with people microdosing, and there's a lot of resolution of things like anxiety, depression, OCD, addiction. Uh, but underlying all of that, these are all symptoms. Underlying depression, OCD, addiction is my cosmology is more around Thomas More's work, Care of the Soul. What's happening on the soul level? And of course, saying the word soul, even in the context of science, is taboo and edgy because we have no idea. What is there proof of the soul? Spirituality is edgy to talk about. But in more indigenous cultures, this is all part of the conversation. And we have to look at the individual wholly as that. What's really beautiful about Iboga is Iboga is also a really big ancestral medicine. And this was very much taught to us by our teachers that we've mentioned in Sci and Law. When I first started working with them, I was like, ancestors? Who now? And what does this have to do with my current life?
Hmm.
But this coming together of ancestors and the study of epigenetics, where just for one example, one generation of mice were subjected, unfortunately, to an electrical shock alongside the smell of cherry blossoms. Now, 4 generations later, their offspring were exposed to the smell of cherry blossoms, and what was observed was their physical symptomology was to go into protection, was to go into as if they were experiencing a physical shock. And we know now that we're able to trace that our environment impacts the hormones that are released in our body. And the hormones released in our body will impact the ways that our genes express. So there's very much a outer environment to inner environment expression within ourselves. This is undeniable now. So what I found so much with these patients working with them was we weren't just working with the accident. This was the starting point, but really the progression of the 6 weeks, there is a particular track, which is first looking at the mind. How does Iboga work to amplify our specific neurosynaptic sequences, our thought patterns, our behavioral patterns? Then, as we go a little deeper, the inner children. What were the experiences that we had in our early developmental years that really lay down the foundation for who we then experience ourselves in our personality? Over the years, this is then mistaken as the who we are, the core of who we are. But in reality, it's most likely patterns, um, neurons that are wiring together that then start to fire together, these associations that then we think, oh, this is the me. But oftentimes you're not going to find a baby that's born who has OCD. These are learned or in response to our environment and culture, and perhaps genetics that are being informed from many past generations. Up to 14 is what's seen with some studies with earthworms. So to kind of bring that all back, we kind of start with the injury that they incurred, but what I ended up really finding was really rich, unresolved material from early childhood years that may be playing a role, of course, in their ability to fully heal from perhaps a more physical traumatic injury.
Thank you, Teresa. And just a couple of thoughts on my end here. I really appreciate you bringing up intergenerational trauma. The research you brought up, it also had me thinking about, I think Dr. Rachel Yehuda has done research on intergenerational trauma, looking at the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And it really does look like, yeah, it could be passed down and people's genes are changing. Another thing I wanted to share, I loved the therapeutic progression notes like so much. I just thought I'd share the most interesting thing I read was with one of the individuals with the longer term follow up, and perhaps due to the combination of the therapy and the microdosing, they were able to catch when they were falling into maybe a depressive episode. They were able to catch it early. Um, Sorry, it's somewhat random, but I thought I would just mention that because you talked about how important it was that the therapeutic progression notes were included in this case series. So we've spoken about a bit how a lot of things were coming together in this protocol, and I'm sure you two have been asked this a million times already, but I do have to ask, like, when looking at the results, what people experience from this, from the microdosing along with the therapy, do you think one way and the other, like maybe for the cognitive symptoms that were improved, okay, that was mostly the microdosing Iboga, and then maybe for the emotional psychological, you're thinking, oh, maybe mostly the therapy, or do you have any thoughts on this at the current time?
I believe that they're connected, and I would not challenge the protocol by separating them and seeing, we know that what therapy looks like in isolation. We know what therapy looks like when paired with a conventional SSRI or an anxiolytic. But I think that it would be a miss potentially. I don't want to invoke the term unethical, but I think that there is a really tight connection of set and setting. And we know this with psychedelics as it pertains to other research, and whether that's in a macro or microdosing context. But I think that if the protocol were to be repeated and just offering the medicine without the psychotherapy, that the results would not be as impressive.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Um, so you did touch on it a bit, um, but I think it is important to really look at this. I hear a lot of people, they'll say, oh, like we right, we can't forget maybe ancient indigenous communities who have used these plants, and then that kind of ends there. Like that's what people say, but we don't go deeper into it. I think I've probably been guilty of this myself, but I feel like this is a good opportunity to maybe learn here. um you know like Iboga isn't new. um where does it come from, and what have people traditionally used it for? Yeah.
This is all you, Teresa.
Yeah. Well, I would be remiss if I weren't to talk about the porcupine, which one is one of my favorite origin folklore that is passed around within the Iboga community, which is that there was a porcupine that was seen by the forest people, the Pygmy,
Mm.
in Africa, and that they observed the porcupine chewing on this bark. And the version of the story that I like is that then they observed it doing a very peculiar thing for a porcupine, which is to turn itself onto its back and to reveal its belly. It's a very vulnerable thing to do, especially for an animal that lives its life underneath spikes. And so then the story goes, the pygmy, gathered some of that bark and, chewed on it as they did and observed and had the experience of its profound effects. The pygmy people were then passed this plant medicine to the Bwiti, and the Bwiti were said to already be doing these initiation rituals, coming of age rituals with the different sacraments. But then after being introduced to the Iboga basically became their center sacrament that they would use for these rituals, which have been done. And they really do see Iboga as a spirit, as a sentience, not just as, a medicine that they're taking to treat an ailment, but for them, it really is about going in and really having a very close to near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, And when people who walk through these ceremonies, they talk specifically about many gates that are passed, meeting ancestors, receiving new names from the ancestors as they pass through this initiation. And so it's quite an ordeal. I applaud people who have gone and moved through the Bwiti initiation. It's something that probably is not for everyone, and
Hmm.
this is why I think it's very interesting in this time where these medicines are crossing to different cultures, and there's deep debate about whether or not it should be held solely inside of the context in which has been originally held for a long time. And I have to give a lot of credit to a ayahuasca lineage that I've been studying with for the last decade, and the teachers within that lineage for teaching me the nuance of this conversation, and not to be so quick, perhaps, to jump in some place to say it should only be done on its native land. It should only be held in its original way of ceremony. When people ask me, oh, were the indigenous people microdosing? No, they probably weren't sitting there saying, okay, 4 days on, 3 days off, and we're going to use our scale to measure. That's definitely a more Western thing. But yes, the pygmy people were chewing small amounts in their day to day. So it's not to say that they weren't microdosing, but the microdosing term is something that's new. And I do believe that different cultures are going to need different contexts. Someone who is a war vet going deep down, perhaps into the jungle where there's no English being spoken. Or I'll just speak to myself. The bigger experience wasn't helping me surface the complex PTSD symptoms that I wanted so much to work on. It was only in the context of microdosing in which that was able to come forward. And I think that's why I feel so adamant about really talking about the effects, the possibilities of microdosing. But at the same time, I'm a big proponent of ceremony, of not of people being able to step into a ceremonial context, because again, this is the holistic, integrative portion of talking about ancestors, of working with the conversation of where does spirituality come in. And I'm so supportive of the clinical context, because for some, the clinical context, the ability to really be alongside doctors, that might be the best for them as well. So it's so important that each individual really understand what their needs are, and that providers and people who are all in this space know how to have the nuanced conversation, instead of continuing to think it's a one solution fits all. It's really not. And the same goes for every psychedelic, every plant medicine, every prognosis, every diagnosis, every symptom, every point in life. What we're going through at different points in life might call for different plants that are going to support the healing and the treatment that we need. So it was a bit of a workaround, but all to say that we have so much to thank for the people who have been holding these traditions, many people who have lost their lives, many people who have lost their credibility. Burton and I have talked ourselves about what it means to speak so publicly and be really advocating for this, and being people who don't come from these specific traditions. But what I'll also say is we're all indigenous. And one of the big things also that we're working towards today is helping each other remember the roots that we all come from. And also, we all come from the same roots as well. So when we get into conversations that start to paint again the story of separation based upon skin color or geographical origin, it already starts to move us in this place where we start to forget that we all are in one same race and have all come from the same place. And the differences that we experience in skin color have to do with climate and geography. And that these medicines are here to really support us with the guidance in the integrity for us to look towards people who have come before us to help us learn from them
Mm,
and to be in right relationship with them and these medicines.
absolutely. No, so well said. Thank you so much, Teresa. So maybe, two more questions I have for both of you. Before the study, was there any prior like signal, even anecdotal, that low dose psychedelics, and maybe actually Iboga falls under the class of an onarogen, but broadly maybe psychedelic. But was there any evidence prior to this case study that low dose psychedelics might help in neurological or neurodegenerative conditions?
Yeah, so there's a couple different elements there that I will speak to. Again, I want to be broad and general. When we look at a more cited psychedelic in psilocybin, there is research and a more robust foundation in the literature on the microdosing context. And what we can see is that with psilocybin, there's both the neuroplasticity element that we can see across the psychedelic landscape and also an anti-inflammatory effect. And as you can imagine, there's certain conditions and diagnoses in which a larger dose where there's a shift in consciousness might not be appropriate. For example, in dementia. And so there is work being done at the Johns Hopkins University in looking at cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's dementia with concomitant depression through psilocybin study. And there was a paper that was published recently, within a year, at UCSF looking at psilocybin specifically for Parkinson's disease. And as we know, with Parkinson's, as it progresses, you can get the changes in cognition and a different type of dementia, potentially Lewy body dementia. And so there is absolute merit in studying not only these macrodose contexts, but yeah, having a respect for the individual, the curation of this is where the art of medicine really comes in, where a protocol can be designed for the individual depending on the needs. I think it's great that Teresa spoke to how it was only through microdosing that the elements of complex PTSD were able to be addressed with care. And I also think there's something special to be said about not everyone will want to go to Mexico or sit under cardiac monitoring for days at a time. We have to meet the people where they're at. And if access is the question, and if this medicine has the potential to heal, then we need to reach as many people as possible where they're willing to be met. And microdosing is a really unique, curated avenue to address that need.
Great. So, first of all, Burton, Teresa, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the channel. This has like really been a fascinating discussion, and like I'm actually really looking forward to rewatching this interview because there's just so many great takeaways here. It's so to to wrap up here, I'd like to ask you both, maybe what are you most looking forward to in terms of the future of psychedelic research or psychedelic medicine? And is there anything that keeps you up at night? Anything that worries you?
I'm happy to go first. So,
Great.
the thing that I'm most excited about is a project in which I'm currently working on, and that is the Fathom study. This is work under Gul Dolan and Steven Zeidler of UC Berkeley and Johns Hopkins, respectively. Fathom stands for Psychedelic Healing Adjunct Therapy Harnessing Opened Malleability. And a little bit different because we're not looking at the mental health pathology of depression, addiction, or anxiety, but instead we are really interested in stroke recovery. So
Mm,
when patients have a stroke, they're after a few months of working with rehabilitation, PT and OT, they plateau and they're left with the deficit. And it doesn't matter how much physical therapy you're going to offer them, there's a degree of residual weakness, for example, that that person will live with. And what the Fathom study is looking to answer is, can psychedelics, through the pathway of reopening critical periods, neuroplasticity, metaplasticity, and creating a state of malleability, when paired with the right context, in this case, intense physical therapy and non-task based learning, can we promote recovery years out from when the injury took place? And that first study that's currently recruiting is in phase 1, looking at safety. And I anticipate a phase 2 will be forthcoming shortly thereafter. And that gives me a lot of hope. I'm really excited to see how that unfolds. And the other element of hope that I have is the progress that's being done in the legislative space. We're seeing states and smaller city jurisdictions with many different bills that are currently under consideration, leading to pathways of decriminalization, uh, pathways to medical legalization,
Hmm.
and even at the federal level, as of last month, through the heels of the executive action, funding going towards the VA to study PTSD in utilizing 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or MDMA.
Mhm.
And so I am following this space and educating patients in a way that respects the Schedule 1 status while offering either clinical trial pathways,
Yep.
but also partnering with uh, colleagues like Teresa and those in Africa that we've spoken about, where these pathways do have uh, access, where patients can get healing. And again, I just call back to when I first learned about this in fellowship. I felt that I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I wasn't doing what I can to get the word out, challenge preconceived notions and judgments, because what I've witnessed in my practice and through stories of patients sharing what they have discovered through their own self-directed healing in allying with plant medicine, it's extremely inspiring. And so the effort is to continue to spread the word and offer education and knowledge.
And I'm really looking forward to continuing to follow your research. And this Fathom study sounds fascinating. I'm really happy to hear that this is being stroke recovery is being looked into. Teresa, how about you?
Yes, that's just Burton. I just so appreciate you bring such enthusiasm and energy. And I remember going to the MAPS conference, the 2 conferences ago. I forget which year that was. Was it 2023, 24, 23? Yeah. And I just couldn't believe it when I was walking through, the such variety of presentations, and to hear so many MDs on the stage speaking of their own experience with psychedelics and plant medicines. And it was, the space has changed so much. And what feels so exciting is there's so much, conversation around it. I feel really so excited about this case study series. We worked on it for many years
Hmm.
and have passed it back and forth and back and forth. And just the process of editing and receiving edits was a process for Burton and I as well. And, for it to be the first publication out there on microdosing with Iboga, this is really, really big. I really was endeavoring to spend the time to take in what that meant. And what I feel really excited about is just what might come forward.
Hmm.
I hope that this opens up the interest for more and more people to research, to put even more rigorous research to look and see, does microdosing with Iboga also lead to the same increases in white matter in the brain that we see with the flood doses that Nolan Williams' work?
Hmm.
I'm just so curious to do and see more research on what does microdosing, what specifically with microdosing do, and again, just the implications for treatment for people. I would feel very happy going to the grave knowing that that hopefully this will start more and more research looking into this.
Yeah.
I think what would keep me up at night, generally with all of uh, access and so much of the spotlight on psychedelics, is a really important piece on integration.
Yeah.
There can be a chasing, perhaps, of these big transformative experiences, and something that Sai, our Iboga teacher, has called silver bulletitis, and also the way that our own brains like to sensationalize. Therefore, sometimes the media can sensationalize, and the way that we want to capture these really small bites of information with forgetting again the nuance that is so important here. But I can't speak enough to the importance of integration, because again, if we kind of go to have the treatment, it's like the question that we had around just having the treatment and therapy. You can, of course, just have the treatment and just work with the plant.
Mm-hmm.
That there perhaps are some cases where that could just be enough. And with all of it, it really depends on whether or not you choose to integrate the changes that you have observed or now have insight into. Nothing is really going to change for the long term if, say, Iboga all of a sudden gives you this insight that, oh, this traumatic experience that happened led me to develop a certain subset of behaviors that are addiction-seeking behaviors, in order to cope with the pain that was there.
Yeah.
Without the support, the holding, the support, the nurturing to have the corrective experience really be taken into the nervous system, for the nervous system to really understand, oh, okay, this traumatic experience is no longer happening now. Those neurons that have been firing for a decade, 2 decades, that have been protecting me so deeply from that which I needed protection from, is no longer needed anymore. For that corrective experience to really take hold, for us to take advantage of the opening of the critical period that many psychedelics and plant medicines give us access to repeat that, it's like going to the gym, to create new patterns of neural behavior, to then become that who is going to be the most thriving and happy and successful in this life. Well, then the old neurons will just continue firing, and there's nothing wrong. There's no shame about where we are at, really. It's just, what support do we want to become the person that we want to become, which is, I think, the endeavor of all humans, of all humanity. We're continually in this place where we are loving to grow. We are getting to know ourself over and over and over again, because we're never the same self. So I think the thing that keeps me up at night is whether or not, as things move through legislation, hopefully in the way that is going to create more access, do we in parallel build the knowledge, the supports, the attitude, the orientation, the right relationships with other cultures who have seen what is the most helpful or not helpful? Do we really work together to build a appropriate ecosystem, infrastructure, environment of care that's not just about treating symptoms, but really is about true health, proactive health, not reacting, but true health, caring for someone's ability to be empowered in their health, to make sovereign decisions for themselves, to understand that they are an individual case and not just a statistic. So all of this, I think, is really, it's going to take all players across industries to realign with new values that really promote health in this way. And so for me, that's the thing that I spend a lot of time worrying about. And But at the same time, like Burton said, I have so much hope, actually. If anything, what these plants teach us is that there's a lot of hope. And so we find ourselves in a really exciting place today.
And the hope is infectious from both of you. Thank you again so much for coming on the channel, Dr. Burton Tabaac, Teresa Yung. I'm going to put the link of the paper in the description section, and I hope everyone enjoyed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay.
It's been a pleasure.